Enjoy being grizzly bear food, Captain. The cruel mocking smirk of David, the stepfather I had supported with millions of dollars, pierced straight into my eyes. He revved the engine of the pickup truck, abandoning me, completely unarmed, in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness. Along with my stepsisters, they had stripped away all my food, water, and survival gear. Jessica leaned out the passenger window, her lip curled in pure venom. Mother's money won't save you out here. They were absolutely certain the 50-meter of untamed wilderness would tear me apart, clearing the path for them to swallow my entire trust fund. But they were wrong. Just 8 hours later, while the two of them were sniffling as they pushed open their hotel room door, rehearsing their tears-soaked death notification script, the deadbolt clicked with a bone-chilling sound from the inside. I sat perfectly still in the darkness, my ice-cold gaze drilling into their two terrified pale faces. The bears send regards. Before continuing, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel, but only if you really want to know the ending of this story. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is there. The silence in that hotel room mirrored the exact suffocating quiet of my childhood home, the day my mother passed away 15 years ago. I stood by her sterile hospital bed, the relentless rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor, filling the otherwise dead air. I was just a teenager gripping her frail, trembling fingers as if my own sheer willpower could somehow anchor her to this world. She coughed, a terrible rattling sound that shook her thin frame, and her grip tightened painfully around my knuckles until the bones ground together. The IV drip swayed on its metal pole from the force of her convulsion. A nurse hovered near the doorway clipboard, pressed to her chest, eyes lowered. She knew what was coming. So did I. My mother pulled me closer, and the effort cost her everything she had left. Her voice was barely a thread so faint I had to press my ear against her cracked lips to catch each word. "Take care of them, Angela," she whispered. "They are your family now. Don't let them fall apart." I nodded slowly, swallowing the heavy knot of tears that sealed itself inside my throat like wet concrete. I had just signed a tragic contract written in raw grief, and the ink was my mother's last breath. The heart monitor flatlined 11 minutes later. I was still holding her hand when they pulled the sheet over her face. David arrived 40 minutes after she died, smelling like an expensive restaurant, apologizing about traffic. He glanced at the covered body, checked his watch, and asked the attending nurse about the estate paperwork. He did not touch her hand. He did not say goodbye. He patted my shoulder twice the way you pat a stranger's dog, and told me everything was going to be fine. Even then, standing in the fluorescent glow of that hospital corridor, with my mother's warmth still fading on my fingers, I knew his definition of fine had nothing to do with mine. The ink on her multi-million-dollar will was not even dry before David began his relentless campaign of financial extraction. He did not look at me and see a grieving daughter. He saw an endless, unregulated ATM machine. Less than a week after the funeral, while the flowers on her grave were still wilting. In the Seattle rain, he began bringing his shady business associates into our home. They poured my mother's expensive, aged scotch into crystal glasses, their laughter bouncing off the walls of the dining room where she used to sit every morning with her cup of chamomile tea. David leaned back in her chair, the one nobody else ever used, the one that still held the faint indent of her body, and openly bragged about the massive trust fund that would soon cover his string of pathetic failed investments. I observed it all from the shadows of the mahogany staircase, my bare feet cold on the hardwood, locking my jaw so tightly my teeth ached. One of his associates, a thick-necked man in a cheap suit, raised his glass and winked in my direction. David waved him off like I was the family dog. My mother's legacy was being desecrated on a Tuesday night by men who never earned a single dollar in that house. But the promise I made to her kept my tongue tied and my hands bound. I was a prisoner of my own loyalty, and David had already found the key to my cell guilt. 5 agonizing years later, the financial bleeding had evolved into an absolute hemorrhage. I sat alone at the sprawling kitchen island at 6 in the morning, staring blankly at a towering stack of overdue notices and aggressive final warnings from creditors. The pile was almost 8 in tall. utility shut-off notices, collection agency letters with red stamps, a foreclosure warning on a rental property David had purchased in my mother's name without telling me. David swaggered into the kitchen, smelling of stale cigar smoke and cheap cologne, casually tossing a crumpled, sweat-stained piece of paper onto the pristine marble counter. It was a $25,000 casino marker from an underground poker ring. I looked up slowly, my eyes narrowing with suppressed rage. David did not even flinch. He simply poured himself a black coffee, refusing to make eye contact with the girl footing the bill. He set the mug down hard enough to slush dark liquid onto the counter, right onto the foreclosure letter. "Take care of it by Friday." "Angela," he commanded, his tone dripping with unearned authority. "Your mother wouldn't want me publicly humiliated. It would ruin the family name." Jessica followed right behind him, the sharp clacking of her heels echoing on the tile like a metronome counting down my patience. She swung a brand new limited edition, $3,000 designer handbag onto the counter, carelessly dropping the luxury boutique receipt right next to David's casino debt. "Refill." She caught my glare and rolled her eyes, casually admiring her flawless makeup reflection in the microwave door. "Don't look at me like that," Jessica sneered, flipping her hair over her shoulder. "You owe us this lifestyle. You're the only family we have left." I did not scream. I did not throw the coffee in their faces. I simply picked up my pen and signed the checks in dead hollow silence, watching the ink dry on each one like blood drying on a wound. I was actively trading every shred of my personal dignity just to keep the ghost of my mother satisfied. They did not just take my money. They systematically invaded my privacy and destroyed my peace of mind. One rain-soaked afternoon, I returned exhausted from a college prep course to find my bedroom door wide open. The lock had been jimmied with a butter knife, the brass plate scratched and bent. The room had been thoroughly ransacked, drawers hung open. My closet had been emptied onto the floor. Jessica was sitting cross-legged on my carpet, carelessly tossing my mother's irreplaceable antique jewelry into her own cheap vanity case, tangling delicate gold chains without a care, snapping the clasp of a pearl bracelet that my grandmother had given my mother on her wedding day. When I rushed forward and forcefully grabbed her wrist to stop her, David instantly materialized in the doorway, blocking my only exit. He grabbed my shoulder, his grip painfully tight, his bourbon-soaked breath hitting my face like a physical blow. "Stop being so damn dramatic, Angela," he commanded, twisting the narrative instantly to paint me as the villain. "She's just borrowing a few pieces for a party. You have everything anyway. Stop acting like a spoiled brat." I forcefully yanked my shoulder out of his oppressive grip. I did not cry. I did not waste breath arguing with parasites. I simply analyzed the severe tactical disadvantage of my current environment. I was entirely surrounded by hostiles in my own home, outnumbered, outmaneuvered, fighting a losing battle against emotional extortion with no reinforcements coming. I realized that night with brutal clarity that I could not survive in their toxic ecosystem for another month. I needed unyielding discipline. I needed a permanent way out. While David snored in his study and Jessica posted selfies in my mother's jewelry on social media, I executed my own silent extraction. I packed a single rugged olive drab duffel bag, taking only my essential legal documents, a change of clothes, and my mother's old dog tags from her brief time in the military reserves. The metal was cold and smooth against my palm, and for the first time in 5 years, I felt my mother's real presence, not the ghost David had weaponized. I walked quietly past his mahogany study, listening to him snoring loudly next to an empty bottle of bourbon, sleeping off another night of expensive funded alcoholism. I stepped out into the freezing Seattle downpour, pulling my hood up as the heavy wooden front door clicked shut behind me, sealing away that chapter of my life with a sound that was softer than a whisper, but louder than anything I had ever said to them. I marched straight through the flooded streets to the military recruiter's office downtown, sitting on the wet concrete steps until they opened at dawn. I did not just need a job or an escape route. I needed an iron fortress. I needed a place where suffering had a purpose and discipline was rewarded, not exploited. I swore to the cold morning air that I would forge myself into something they could never break, never manipulate. never leech from again. The transition was a violently physical shock to the system. Within weeks, I went from the suffocating plush carpets of my mother's estate to crawling on my stomach through the freezing, jagged mud of Paris Island. The icy rain slashed against my Kevlar helmet as I dragged my heavy rifle through the flooded trench barbed wire, snagging my uniform inches above my spine. Every muscle fiber in my arms tore, every breath burned my lungs like inhaled glass, but I welcomed the sheer agony. It was pure, honest pain, entirely unlike the insidious psychological torture back home. There were no hidden agendas in a mud pit, no gaslighting in a firing range. A senior drill instructor stood directly over me, his combat boots sinking into the muck, his voice booming through the relentless downpour like the voice of God passing judgment. Keep moving. Recruit blood is just weakness leaving the body. I gritted my teeth, tasting the metallic tang of dirt and blood, and mastered my breathing to aggressively suppress the haunting, nagging memories of David's condescending sneers and Jessica's entitled laughter. I pushed forward, elbows digging fiercely into the dirt, slowly transforming my civilian vulnerability into something harder than the steel of my rifle barrel. Every yard I crawled was a yard further from that mahogany staircase. Every bruise was proof that pain could build, not just destroy. The true agonizing test of my resolve did not happen on the brutal obstacle courses. It happened in the dead quiet of the barracks. During the weekly mail call, exhausted recruits would cluster around the center aisle, weeping openly over perfumed letters and care packages from home. Mothers sent cookies wrapped in wax paper and handwritten prayers folded into tiny squares. Fathers sent newspaper clippings and proud notes that said things like, "We believe in you." Girlfriends sent photographs kissed with lipstick. I stood at strict, rigid attention at the foot of my perfectly made bunk, staring snorts blankly at the cold cinder block wall. My name tag perfectly centered on my chest. My name was never called, not once, not a single envelope, not a package, not even a postcard. 52 weeks of training, 52 mail calls, 0 letters. Jessica was undoubtedly outmaxing my credit cards at designer boutiques. David was probably racking up debts at a high-stakes blackjack table, blissfully ignoring the fact that the daughter funding his lifestyle was eating cold rations and sleeping on a steel-framed cot 600 meters away. The silence from Seattle was deafening, a heavy weight pressing against my chest every single week like a sandbag strapped to my ribs. But instead of breaking down, I took that rejection and locked my vulnerability in an impenetrable steel box deep within my mind. I did not need their fake validation or conditional love anymore. I clamped my jaw shut, focusing solely on the cold, reassuring weight of the rifle sling across my chest. My weapon and my discipline were my family now. They never missed a mail call. I channeled every single ounce of familial betrayal into achieving absolute physical and tactical superiority. I pushed myself dangerously harder than any other recruit in my platoon. I outran the strongest men on the grueling 3-mile endurance trails, my legs burning until I could not feel them below the knee. I outshot the seasoned veterans on the precision firing range, grouping my rounds so tight the drill instructor held up my target paper for the entire platoon to see. I absorbed tactical manuals until my eyes blurred, and the overhead fluorescent lights burned halos into my vision, memorizing logistics chains and supply route calculations that made senior officers raise their eyebrows. When graduation day finally arrived, I stood at the absolute top of my class. I earned my commission as an officer, feeling the sharp pin of the silver bars being pressed forcefully into my collar by a commanding general whose handshake nearly crushed my knuckles. Those bars were not just a symbol of rank, they were an impenetrable suit of armor. I officially became Captain Angela Wilson, a commander of logistics and engineering. I learned to command total respect, with a single, unblinking glance, replacing my lingering teenage insecurities with the cold, fiercely calculating mind of a battlefield tactician. I had finally built a version of myself that David and Jessica could never manipulate, never bully, and never break. 3 grueling years into my active duty service, I had successfully built an impenetrable fortress around my heart and my assets. I achieved total, unquestionable financial independence entirely through my military allowances, combat pay, and by legally locking down the smart long-term investments of my mother's trust fund. I hired a private wealth manager named Richard, who answered only to me and put every account behind dual signature verification. I was financially untouchable on paper. I sat alone in my sterile, heavily secured base office in Virginia, reviewing massive logistics manifests under the hum of fluorescent strip lights, feeling completely detached from the pathetic parasites back home. But the haunting ghost of my mother's dying wish still lingered in the back of my mind, a tiny, invisible crack in my otherwise flawless armor. Despite my hatred for them, I continued to authorize a minimal, heavily restricted monthly stipend to David's account, blindly fulfilling my duty to the dead. Every time I signed the transfer, my pen hand tightened until my knuckles went white, and I had to physically force my fingers to release the pen afterward. Some months, I would hold the pen over the signature line for a full minute, the tip hovering my jaw locked before the echo of my mother's voice in that hospital room broke through my resolve and forced my hand down. $2,000 a month. Not enough to sustain their lifestyle, just enough to keep the promise technically alive, like a patient on life support that everyone knows will never wake up. I was fully prepared for any hostile combat scenario abroad, but I severely underestimated the domestic calculated ambush they were slowly, greedily preparing in the shadows. They were waiting for the perfect moment to strike, and my guilt was the only door they needed left unlocked. It was during a highly classified joint Special Forces logistics drill in brutal winter conditions near the Canadian border that I learned what the word family actually meant. I was personally overseeing a critical high-risk supply drop when the unpredictable mountain weather turned instantly lethal. A sudden violent avalanche of heavy snow and shattered timber collapsed the primary command shelter without warning. The world went sideways. I was thrown to the ground, heavily pinned down under a massive steel support beam, the freezing dark pressing viciously against my ribs like a giant fist squeezing the air out of my chest. I could not move my legs. The oxygen was rapidly thinning, and with every shallow breath, I drew the space around me seemed to shrink. Ice water seeped through my uniform collar and ran down my spine. I did not have to scream or beg for help. Within seconds of the collapse, my unit was swarming the treacherous wreckage, frantically digging through the jagged ice and twisted metal with their bare hands, willingly risking severe frostbite and secondary collapse for a trapped comrade. Through blood stained their tactical gloves, fingernails cracked and torn, but not a single soldier stopped digging. Not one of them paused to calculate the personal cost. No one asked what was in it for them. The man who physically leveraged the crushing steel beam off my chest was Marcus Hayes, a massively built, seasoned Special Forces operator, acting as the elite survival instructor for our drill. He dragged me out of the freezing, suffocating crater by my tactical harness, with one arm, his own face caked in jagged ice and dark dirt, a gash above his left eyebrow, streaming blood that froze in thin red lines down his cheek. We did not talk much as the medics checked my vitals in the chaotic canvas medevac tent. The heavy silence between combat soldiers always speaks volumes, and that silence carried more loyalty than David's entire vocabulary of empty promises. Marcus simply tossed me a foil packet of military rations, sitting heavily on the squeaking metal cot right next to mine, his rifle resting across his knees. He checked his magazine with practiced ease, slapped it back into the receiver, and looked me dead in the eye. "I got your sick, Captain," he stated flatly. There was absolutely no manipulation in his voice, no guilt-tripping, no hidden financial agendas, no strings attached, no invoice coming in the mail. It was just raw, unconditional loyalty forged in extreme hardship, a lifeline I never knew existed because the people who should have provided it were too busy stealing from me. Sitting quietly by a roaring makeshift kerosene heater with Marcus later, that freezing night, the bitter truth crashed into me with the overwhelming force of a physical blow to the stomach. I would take a bullet for these strangers without a second thought, and they had just definitively proven they would do the exact same for me. Meanwhile, the people who actually shared my mother's blood were back in Seattle, comfortably insulated by my hard-earned money, actively plotting how to squeeze another luxury car out of my bank account. David was probably on his third bourbon feet up on my mother's mahogany coffee table. Jessica was probably photographing her new handbag for her social media followers, tagging the brand, thanking no one. Bloodline was nothing more than a random genetic accident. True brotherhood was a conscious daily choice. Staring into the flames, I finally stopped feeling guilty for hating my stepfather. I watched the burning kerosene reflected in my dog tags, the ones my mother wore first, and the toxic illusion of my childhood family completely burned away, leaving behind a cold, unshakable clarity that settled into my bones like steel reinforcement. The fire popped, and I did not flinch. I returned from that grueling winter deployment, fundamentally changed at my core. I was no longer a traumatized, easily manipulated girl, trying desperately to buy the affection of her abusers. I was a hardened protector of my own boundaries. I knew exactly how to read hostile terrain, how to spot a carefully hidden ambush, and how to execute a devastating tactical counterstrike with zero hesitation. I carried this profound, unshakable sense of absolute self-worth back to civilian life, integrating it into every decision I made. I updated my personal security protocols, changed every password, added dual authorization on every financial account, and had Richard run a full audit on every dollar the Stewarts had touched in the last 8 years. The results were sickening. Nearly $2 million siphoned through casino debts, luxury purchases, failed business ventures, and a condo in David's name that I never authorized. I documented everything and locked it in a fireproof safe. I was fully prepared for the inevitable day the parasites would realize the monthly stipend was not enough to feed their insatiable greed and try to bite the hand that fed them. The shield was up, and my weapons were hot. 4 long years after my promotion to Captain the Shadow, I thought I had outrun, finally returned. I was standing in the heavily air-conditioned marine logistics hub, reviewing a highly complex tactical supply manifest on a digital tablet when my personal encrypted phone vibrated aggressively against my hip. The caller ID flashed a name I had not seen in over 12 months, Jessica. My muscles tightened instinctively, instantly dropping my posture into a rigid combat-ready stance before I could even process the emotion. I tapped the wireless earpiece, maintaining absolute chilling radio silence, waiting for the enemy to make the first move. Jessica's voice whimpered through the static, her tone dripping with desperate, carefully manufactured remorse. "Angela, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. That day Dad drank too much and I was too selfish. I know we hurt you. You're the only family we have left." I did not blink. The silence stretching between us was heavier than a loaded weapon. I counted the seconds. 3, 4, 5. She was sweating on the other end. I could hear the faint rustle of paper. She was reading from a script. Years of professionally assessing hostile combatants in high-stress zones kicked in immediately. I did not hear a crying, apologetic sister seeking forgiveness. I analyzed the distinct audio profile of a pathological liar. I tracked her breathing patterns, noting the overly precise theatrical pauses in her sobbing, the way she inhaled too sharply before each emotional phrase, the way her pitch rose at the wrong moments. It was a carefully rehearsed performance entirely devoid of actual panic or genuine regret. She snorts, was reading from a script David had undoubtedly written for her, and I could almost hear the scratch of his pen in the cadence of her words. I kept my face blank, my cold eyes scanning the towering server racks in front of me, shutting down the tiny, vulnerable part of my brain that still wanted a family. I cut through her act with a single blade. "Get straight to the point, Jessica." The sudden shift in her tone on the other end of the line confirmed everything I needed to know. The tears stopped mid-syllable. The professional sob evaporated. The trap was being set, and the trapper had just flinched. She recovered fast, laying the fake sincerity on uncomfortably thick, her voice trembling just enough to sound fragile, but not enough to sound genuine. "Dad and we want to make amends. It's almost the anniversary of Mom's death. Dad booked an eco-camping trip for the 3 of us. To remember Mom, please give us one last chance." the sheer repulsive audacity to weaponize my dead mother's memory, to lure me out into an isolated location, made my blood run freezing cold. My tactical instinct screamed at me to hang up, block the number, and completely sever the cord. But a seasoned tactician never interrupts an enemy when they are making a fatal mistake. I needed to see their ultimate endgame to crush it so thoroughly they could never threaten me again. I let 2 full seconds of dead silence pass just long enough to make her sweat. "Fine, send me the itinerary," I replied instantly, terminating the call before she could even exhale her fake relief. The phone screen went dark in my hand. Game on. The exact moment the line went dead, I pivoted on my heel and activated my secure encrypted terminal on the heavy steel desk. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I bypassed military channels and dialed my private wealth management lawyer in Seattle directly. "Richard, it's me." I ordered, my tone strictly professional, issuing a command rather than a request. "Prepare the papers, draft my new will, and the trust transfer documents immediately. I'm driving to your office in 1 hour to sign and notarize everything in person before I board my flight this weekend. If anything happens to me, not a single cent falls into the Stewart family's hands." Richard confirmed receipt of the order without asking questions. He had worked with enough military officers to know when a command was a command. I hung up the phone, staring at the blank screen. David and Jessica thought they were reeling in a naive, guilt-ridden victim. They did not realize they were actively inviting an apex predator into their carefully planned slaughterhouse. I opened my desk drawer, pulled out a black tactical notebook, and began writing the counter-ambush operation order in precise, neat block letters. If you have ever had a toxic family member try to manipulate you with fake kindness, hit the like button right now. Tell me in the comments how you handled their lies. And don't forget to subscribe, because this counter-ambush is going to be flawless. A week later, the long commercial flight to Alaska was a suffocating, nauseating theater of fake smiles and forced intimacy. David rambled loudly about artificially fond memories of my mother, deliberately making sure the passing flight attendants heard him playing the role of the grieving devoted widower, dabbing at dry eyes with a cloth napkin. Jessica eagerly and submissively poured my water, touching my arm with overly familiar affection that made my skin crawl. I maintained the mask. I smiled when required. I nodded at the right moments. But behind my eyes, I was recording every twitch, every forced laugh, every sideways glance they exchanged when they thought I was looking out the window. When we finally landed and hit the specialized wilderness outfitter store in town, their carefully constructed masks began to slip. David was greedily piling up heavy-duty survival gear at the wooden counter: thick military ropes, intense tactical flares, heavy tarps. Things utterly useless for a simple, relaxing eco trip. Nobody brings 50 feet of industrial rope on a nature walk. I hovered silently by the hydration packs, using the reflection of a display case to catch Jessica, staring intensely at a weather and GPS app on her glowing phone screen. The text was stark and undeniable. Mountain blizzard, distance to town 50 meters. They were not looking for a campsite. They were actively hunting for total isolation. A kill zone where the wilderness would do the work, and their hands would stay clean. I decided to apply a minimal amount of tactical pressure to expose their severe lack of preparation. I cornered them by the heavy expedition backpacks, my tone deceptively casual, but my eyes tracking their frantic micro-expressions like crosshairs. Snorts: "Dad, did you bring the Bowater filter? Jessica, do you know how to tie a non-slip knot?" They both stuttered violently, freezing in place like deer caught in headlights. David offered pathetic, rambling excuses about his wildly exaggerated past camping experiences in college, tripping over his own lies so badly that the store clerk behind the counter raised an eyebrow and set down the rope he was coiling. Jessica just stared at her phone, her acrylic nails frozen mid-tap. They were utterly clueless about actual wilderness survival. They did not know how to purify water. They did not know how to build a shelter. They could not identify a single edible plant or read a topographic map. Its snorts became glaringly obvious that they had absolutely no intention of surviving this trip together. Nadav, They were relying solely on the extreme lethal environment to execute the murder for them, keeping their own soft, manicured hands perfectly clean. Early the next morning at the ranger station, the air was heavy with the scent of pine sap and black coffee. Ranger Captain Thomas Vance, a grizzled veteran of the Alaskan wilds, with a gray beard and hands like sandpaper, glared at our submitted trail, manifest his jaw clenched in visible anger. He slapped the paper down on the wooden counter hard enough to rattle the coffee mugs. "Mr. Stewart, are you kidding me? This 50-mile route is the death zone. Going in there is suicide." David smirked physically, pushing me forward by the shoulder like a human shield to absorb the R's wrath. He squared his shoulders and puffed out his chest, playing the proud father card with sickening ease. "Don't worry, Captain Vance. My daughter here is an active-duty Marine captain. We have her as our guide." He was publicly deliberately establishing my high competence to the authorities to make my incoming accident look like an unavoidable tragic miscalculation that even a Marine could not survive. Vance looked at me, and I saw the deep concern etched into the weathered lines of his face. His eyes moved from David's sweating forehead to Jessica's impractical boots to my military bearing. He knew something was deeply wrong. I stored that observation for later. I looked Vance dead in the eye, maintaining a rigid, uncompromising military posture. "I understand the risks, Captain." Then I threw my tactical curveball. I turned to the wall rack behind the counter and pointed at the locked firearms case. "Captain Vance, I want to rent 2 large-caliber Magnum rifles and bear spray. If we go in there, we need firepower." David panicked instantly, his face draining of all color, sweating profusely under the harsh fluorescent lights of the station. He waved his hands frantically, stumbling backward into a rack of hiking poles that clattered to the floor. "Oh, God, Angela. I'm so sorry. I forgot to bring my gun permit." Vance scowled deeply, crossing his muscular arms in disgust. "No weapons in bear country is a death sentence, Mr. Stewart." Despite the R's grim warning, David adamantly, desperately insisted we go unarmed. He fabricated an excuse about not wanting to disturb the natural environment. A laughable lie from a man who had never set foot outside a casino lobby in the last decade. My suspicions transitioned into absolute undeniable certainty. An unarmed civilian woman, 50 meads from rescue and bear mating season. I was the designated casualty, and the execution was imminent. But the killer had just disarmed himself, and the prey was the only one in the room who actually knew how to survive. Night fell rapidly in the canyon, instantly dropping temperatures to near freezing. Jessica huddled aggressively by the roaring campfire, her eyes shifting nervously toward the pitch-black tree. Terrified of the very environment she planned to leave me in, she rubbed her arms, pulling her designer jacket tighter, the fabric making a hollow, expensive sound against itself. She feigned innocent, morbid curiosity, tilting her head like a child asking about monsters under the bed. "Angela, you've been in the military so long, you must have seen a lot of dead people, right? Like actants in the woods. If someone gets lost, how long until they give up?" David jumped in eagerly, leaning forward on the log, the firelight catching the greedy glint in his eyes. His fingers laced together, knuckles white. "In the military, if a soldier goes missing, how long does it take for the government to issue a death certificate?" They were not even attempting to hide their motives anymore. They were openly, shamelessly, salivating over the legal logistics of my inheritance, practically pricing out their new luxury cars over the corpse they assumed I would soon become. The fire popped and sent a shower of embers into the black sky between us. I let the sparks die before I spoke. I kept my posture completely relaxed, casually, kicking a glowing stray coal back into the fire with the reinforced toe of my boot. I let the silence build until the crackling of the flames was the only sound in the canyon, and both of them were leaning forward, waiting. Accidental deaths, quite a few. But nature isn't the scariest thing. The scariest thing is humans. I locked my unblinking predatory eyes onto David, ensuring he felt the sudden drop in temperature between us. His Adam's apple bobbed hard. Once my unit caught deserters who betrayed their comrades for money, we tied them up, hung them from a tree in the deep forest, made a small cut on their thigh, so the blood dripped down. Just an hour later, The bloodthirsty wolves found them. Their screams when being torn apart alive. You'd never forget it. In the military, betrayal is paid in blood to the ultimate agony. I delivered every word with the flat mechanical precision of someone reading an after-action report. Jessica dropped her marshmallow stick in the dirt, her hands trembling violently. David swallowed hard, his eyes darting away from mine, toward the blackness of the treeing, as if the wolves were already circling. A branch cracked somewhere in the dark. Both of them flinched hard enough to send Jessica's water bottle tumbling off the log. I did not. I picked up a long stick and slowly stirred the coals, watching the sparks rise like tiny distress flares into the freezing black sky. Neither of them spoke for the rest of the evening. David tried to light a cigarette 3 times, but his hands were shaking too badly to hold the flame steady. Jessica pulled her sleeping bag up to her chin and turned her back to the fire, but I could see her shoulders trembling, and it was not from the cold. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, my back against a cold boulder, my hand resting silently on the combat knife hidden in my boot. They thought they were the hunters. They had no idea they were sitting across the fire from something far more dangerous than any predator in those woods. Dawn broke. The freezing silence was completely shattered by the deafening, aggressive roar of the pickup truck engine. I stepped out of my small tent, the freezing fog biting into my face and coating my eyelashes with tiny crystals of ice. David stood by the driver's door, all pretenses of family completely gone, his face twisted in raw, unadulterated malice. His mask was finally off, and the face beneath it was uglier than 15 years of imagination could have prepared me for. "Wake up, Captain. It's time to end this act." I stepped forward slowly, letting my body language communicate controlled surprise, while my mind was already 3 moves ahead. "What the hell are you doing?" David spat violently on the frozen ground, a thick glob of contempt that steamed against the ice. "What I should have done a long time ago. That fortune, that business chain should have been mine. A man's not some brat who wears a uniform and orders people around. Your mother was A for giving it all to you, and you're A for making me beg." The words hit the morning air like gunshots. 15 years of hidden resentment. 15 years of fake smiles and fabricated family dinners and rehearsed gratitude. All vaporized in a single venomous confession. And Jessica smirked cry from the warmth of the passenger seat, rolling down the window just enough to deliver her final blow, her acrylic nails tapping the doorframe in a satisfied rhythm. "Goodbye, Captain. Stay here and command the grizzly bears. Hope you live long enough to see me driving a new Porsche with your money." I did not flinch. I stood perfectly still, a lone figure against the massive Alaskan wilderness. My boots planted in the frozen gravel like concrete pillars. "You are signing your own death warrants," I commanded coldly, my voice cutting cleanly through the roaring engine noise. David laughed, a manic, intensely greedy sound that echoed off the canyon walls and scattered the birds from the nearby pines. "Your death warrant, 50 meters, no water, no food, no weapons. Let's see if your marine tag saves you from a bear's jaws." They slammed the truck into gear and sped off into the thick fog, spraying gravel in my face. The red tail lights disappeared into the gray wall of mist, and the engine noise faded until only the wind and my own steady breathing remained. I did not panic. I did not sit down and cry. I tapped directly into my advanced training, immediately cataloging my assets. 1 combat knife, the clothes on my back, and 15 years of suppressed rage converted into pure fuel. I navigated south for hours, using the position of the sun moving at a pace that would have broken most men until my combat instincts screamed. A twig snapped 20 yards to my left. I drew my knife, pivoted, and lunged at the sound, pressing the cold blade hard to a man's throat in a fraction of a second. His hands flew up. "Easy, Captain. I'm not the enemy." I recognized the voice before I recognized the face. It was Marcus Hayes running independent survival drills in the sector. "Phil," I lowered the knife and debriefed him rapidly. My voice clipped and efficient, laying out the entire situation in under 60 seconds. Marcus's eyes burned with intense military fury, his jaw clenching so hard the muscles in his neck corded like steel cables. "Those bastards. They think they can kill a military officer by starving her in the woods. Idiots." He pulled a folded topographic map from his tactical vest, and traced a line with his thick, scarred finger. "They're driving around the mountain. It'll take about 8 hours, but there's a secret ranger trail. We can beat them by at least 3 hours." The hunt was on. Marcus and I moved like heavily armed shadows across the brutal, unforgiving Alaskan terrain. This was not a recreational hike. It was a high-stakes military exfiltration with a ticking clock and no margin for error. We aggressively rappelled down sheer vertical rock cliffs and traversed freezing waist-deep streams that turned my legs numb within seconds. Marcus rigged his specialized Special Forces rope system across a gorge that dropped 200 feet into a river of white rapids, and I crossed it hand over hand, my arms shaking the wind, slamming into my body like a wall. Every individual muscle fiber in my legs screamed in violent protest, begging for rest. But the burned-in image of David's arrogant, greedy smirk fueled my fire like gasoline on coals. My hands were torn and bleeding from the rock faces, the skin peeling off my palms in wet strips. My knees buckled twice on the steep descents, and both times Marcus grabbed my harness and hauled me upright without a word, without judgment, without a single demand for repayment. We completely shattered the standard hiking records for the sector, operating on pure adrenaline-cold fury and ingrained military grit, absolutely refusing to stop for water or rest. While they were leisurely driving in a heated cabin, plotting their shopping sprees, I was tearing through the wilderness, turning my physical suffering into the very weapon that would ultimately destroy them. By late afternoon, bathed in the sharp crimson light of an Alaskan sunset, we finally breached the dense treeing at Eleanor Briggs's eco-loge. My boots hit the wooden porch and left bloody prints. Eleanor, the sharp-eyed young manager, confirmed our tactical victory the exact moment we stepped into the rustic lobby. "Their pickup truck isn't back yet," she stated firmly, her face contorting in sheer, unadulterated disgust when Marcus rapidly briefed her on the premeditated attempted murder. She grabbed her master keys without hesitation and led us directly to the luxury cabin David had pre-booked. The perimeter was now completely secured. We held the high ground, and the ambush zone was established exactly in the place they had planned to comfortably celebrate my tragic demise. I drank a single bottle of water, refusing to sit down, keeping my muscles primed for the imminent confrontation. The hunt had successfully transitioned into the execution phase. Time was my ultimate weapon, and I wielded it flawlessly. I grabbed Marcus's heavy satellite phone, walking out to the freezing wooden porch to secure an encrypted signal. The cold air hit my sweat-soaked uniform and froze it stiff against my skin. I dialed my private wealth management lawyer directly. "Richard, did you file the documents I signed in your office on Friday?" I demanded, my breathing heavy from the 50-mile march, but my voice totally, chillingly controlled. Richard's response came through, crisp and precise on the other end. "Done, Captain. The new will is notarized. 100% of your mother's assets and company have been transferred to the Veterans Fund and charities. The stewards have absolutely no authority over a single dime." The confirmation echoed through the receiver like the drop of a massive steel blade. I allowed myself a razor-thin, terrifying smile, staring out at the darkening treeing where the first stars were beginning to pierce the purple sky. "Very good." I hung up the satellite phone and handed it back to Marcus, who was leaning against the porch railing with his arms crossed, reading the satisfaction on my face. The financial guillotine was primed, locked, and ready to sever their lifeline. Every dollar they had spent the last 15 years stealing was now permanently redirected to the people who actually deserved it. David's casino debts, Jessica's designer bags, the unauthorized condo, all of it gone. Marcus brought out a micro camera and highly sensitive audio recording gear from his black tactical kit. We moved swiftly, professionally, rigging the living room of the luxury cabin David had pre-booked for their twisted morning phase. Marcus tested every angle, every microphone, ensuring full audio and visual coverage of the kill zone. Then he slipped silently into the adjoining room to act as the armed silent witness. I showered rapidly, washing the dirt, sweat, and betrayal off my skin, watching the brown water swirl down the drain and disappear. I changed into my spare dark combat fatigues, laced my boots tight and sat perfectly still in the dead center of the dark room. I drew my combat knife and slowly, methodically wiped the gleaming steel with a cloth until it reflected the lone yellow streetlight filtering through the blinds. My shadow stretched across the far wall like the silhouette of something ancient and patient. I slowed my heart rate, practicing my breathing. 60 beats per minute. 55-50. The trap was set. The bait was the empty room. The snare was the truth. And the prey was arriving. At exactly 900 p.m., heavy, aggressive tires crunched loudly on the gravel driveway outside the cabin. The brass lock clicked sharply, followed instantly by hushed, frantic whispering echoing in the narrow hallway. David's voice slithered through the door, thick with vile, premeditated calculation. He hissed at Jessica, coaching her one final time. "Remember, Jessica? You have to cry really loud. Just say she went looking for firewood and got lost." They were literally directing a movie about my death. Rehearsing their Oscar-worthy performance for the authorities, for the cameras, for the sympathetic neighbors who would bring casseroles to their grieving doorstep back in Seattle. The heavy oak door swung open, and the two shadows stepped confidently into the room, immediately launching into fake, breathless sobs, dramatically clutching at each other for support. Jessica even produced a crumpled tissue from her sleeve, a prop she had prepared in advance. They were completely blinded by their own greed, entirely unaware of the apex predator sitting less than 10 feet away. I did not move a muscle until the door clicked shut behind them, sealing them inside. Then I reached out and violently flicked on the massive table lamp, flooding the entire room with blinding, unforgiving light. I sat perfectly composed in the center of the room, leaning forward and slamming my heavy combat knife dead center into the wooden table, with a deafening concussive thud that shook the lamp and rattled the windows. The blade sank 2 in into the oak and vibrated with a low, menacing hum. Terrible acting. "You need more practice," I stated, my eyes locking onto theirs like laser sights on a target. Jessica shrieked, a genuine high-pitched wail of pure terror that was nothing like the rehearsed sobs from 30 seconds ago. Angela. She scrambled frantically backward, her expensive boot slipping on the rug, slamming hard into the drywall, with enough force to crack the plaster and send a framed picture crashing to the floor. Her face instantly drained of every single drop of blood, turning a shade of white I had only seen on corpses in field hospitals. David's jaw literally unhinged. His briefcase hit the floor, spilling papers and a half-empty flask of whiskey across the carpet. Snorts. He pointed a violently trembling, sweaty finger at me, his knees visibly buckling under his suddenly massive weight. How could you? 50 meters. Impossible," he gasped, unable to process the total destruction of his flawless murder plot. The woman he had abandoned in the wilderness to be torn apart by bears and hypothermia was sitting right in front of him, clean, composed, and radiating the cold fury of a nuclear reactor, seconds before meltdown. I stood up slowly, letting the oppressive lethal aura of a commanding officer fill the cramped space, suffocating them. My full height cast a shadow across both of their crumbling faces. Arrogance often blinds fools. Did you think 50-meter could kill a commanding officer of the U.S. military? You heavily underestimated the Marine Corps. I reached into my breast pocket, pulled out the thick stack of notarized legal documents, and whipped them violently directly into David's chest. The papers scattered across the floor like dead leaves in a November gust, landing at his feet, around his feet, covering his shoes. Each page, a nail in his coffin. "Here's the reward for your act. The will is revoked. All assets donated to charity. You just lost everything. No company, no trust fund, and absolutely no damn Porsche." I delivered the words like artillery strikes, watching the devastating realization shatter the very core of their identities. The color drained from their faces in stages, like watching a photograph bleach in the sun. They had not just failed to kill me. They had actively orchestrated their own total bankruptcy. Every greedy scheme, every casino marker, every designer handbag, every drop of my mother's scotch they ever stole was now permanently, legally, irrevocably gone. David collapsed heavily to his knees on the carpet, violently clutching his head with both hands, howling like a wounded, pathetic animal, realizing it was caught in a steel trap with no escape. "No, impossible. You have no right. That's my money." He screamed, tears of pure greed streaming down his face, snot running freely into his open mouth. I stepped forward, looming over his pathetic, broken form, my voice dropping to a lethal, icy whisper that was more terrifying than any scream. "Your money. You're just a parasite clinging to my mother. The plan to starve me in the woods. Murder for inheritance. It's all over." The intense, suffocating psychological pressure broke them completely. Jessica slid down the wall to the floor, her mascara running in black rivers down her cheeks, pointing a shaking finger at David. They both began screaming hysterically, turning on each other with the viciousness of cornered rats, blaming each other for the flawed plan, for underestimating me, for not using a more remote location, for not bringing actual weapons, for not checking the ranger trail. They confessed to every detail of the entire premeditated murder plot in their blind panic. Every single damning word captured cleanly by Marcus's hidden microphones in crystal clear high definition. The audio was pristine. The timestamps were ironclad. The confession was voluntary, unprompted, and absolute. Checkmate the next morning. The biting, freezing Alaskan cold was absolutely nothing compared to the absolute terrifying freeze inside the holding cell. Senior investigator Robert Jenkins of the state police had stormed the lodge at midnight, with 4 uniformed officers aggressively snapping heavy steel handcuffs on David and Jessica in front of a lobby completely packed with shocked witnesses. Eleanor Briggs had personally made the call. The high-defin audio recordings from the cabin and the sworn testimonies from Marcus and Ranger Vance were utterly ironclad and airtight case that no defense attorney in the country could crack. Jenkins stood before me in the precinct hallway, his badge catching the cold overhead light, and handed me a freshly printed copy of the devastating arrest report. He straightened his back and addressed me with the respect I had earned. Attempted murder of an active-duty military officer, organized conspiracy to murder. They will never see the sunlight outside those bars again. Jenkins reported strictly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute finality. The trap had closed perfectly. Every single piece had fallen exactly where I had placed it. I stood silently before the steel bars of the holding cell, executing my final cold inspection of the prisoners. Jessica was hyperventilating on the concrete floor, her designer clothes wrinkled and stained with dust and dried tears, her acrylic nails broken from clawing at the cell door. She crawled to the bars, pressing her face between the cold metal, begging hysterically for a mercy she had joyfully denied me just yesterday. Her voice was raw and broken, stripped of every trace of the sneering superiority she had worn like a crown for 15 years. David sat curled up in the darkest corner of the cell, a completely hollow shell, his eyes vacant and dead, his lips moving without sound. The arrogant smirk was gone. The puffed-out chest was deflated. His delusional empire built entirely on stolen money and borrowed time had vanished overnight. They were pathetic, violently stripped of their arrogance, reduced to exactly what they always were, underneath the designer clothes and the fake smiles, cowardly criminals who foolishly thought they could outsmart and outlast a United States Marine. I looked at David's hands, the same hands that had gripped my shoulder in that ransacked bedroom, the same hands that had tossed casino markers on my mother's marble counter, the same hands that had shoved me forward at the ranger station like a human shield. Those hands were now wrapped around his own knees, fingernails bitten to the quick trembling in a concrete box 8 feet by 10 feet, smaller than my bunk at Paris Island. He would learn what real isolation felt like now. He would learn what it meant to have his name never called. I did not offer a single word of closure or forgiveness. They did not deserve my voice. I slowly, deliberately unzipped my civilian jacket, fully revealing the gleaming silver captain's insignia pinned to my uniform collar beneath. The metal caught the harsh fluorescent light and threw a sharp, bright reflection across the cell bars, across their broken faces. I turned my back on them in one crisp, definitive military pivot, my boots clicking once on the concrete, ignoring Jessica's final, desperate screams that echoed down the hallway and faded into nothing. I walked out of that precinct. I pushed open the heavy glass doors and I inhaled deeply, filling my lungs with the crisp, clean Alaskan morning air, purging the last toxic remnants of misplaced loyalty and crushing guilt from my system forever. The cold air tasted like freedom. It tasted like 15 years of chains falling off my wrists and shattering on the frozen ground beneath my boots. I did not look back. There was nothing behind me worth seeing. 6 months later, I stood shoulder to shoulder with Marcus, who had transitioned seamlessly from a battlefield ally to a trusted foundation partner on a small wooden stage in front of a converted community center in Virginia. We officially launched the Catherine Wilson Veterans Trust, named after the only person in my bloodline who ever truly loved me. I looked out at the hopeful, resilient faces of transitioning female veterans. We were funding with the exact money David had tried to steal. Women who had served their country and been abandoned by their families. Women who wore the same invisible scars I carried beneath my uniform. Marcus stood at my right, arms clasped behind his back, the faintest trace of a proud, measured nod on his weathered face. He did not need to say a word. The parasites were rotting in a concrete cage, awaiting a trial. They could not win, represented by a public defender they could not afford. But I, Captain Angela Wilson, was marching forward into the dawn, finally commanding a life that belonged entirely to me. I built it with my own bloodied hands, my own broken bones, and my own unbreakable will. And no one, not a single soul on this earth, would ever take it from me again. After the ceremony, a young veteran, barely 24, with a fresh scar running from her temple to her jawline, approached me at the refreshment table. She gripped my hand with the firm, calloused squeeze of someone who had served, and told me her stepmother had stolen her deployment savings while she was overseas. She asked me how I survived it. I looked at her scar, then at Marcus standing guard by the door out of habit, then at the framed photograph of my mother hanging on the wall behind the podium. The only picture I kept, the one where she wore her reserve dog tags and smiled like the world still made sense. I squeezed the young veteran's hand back and gave her Richard's business card. Some battles are fought with rifles, some are fought with lawyers. The ones that matter most are fought by simply refusing to stay down when the people who should have loved you are the ones standing on your chest. If you felt a wave of satisfaction when that jail cell locked behind them, smash the like button and subscribe right now. Share in the comments the proudest moment you finally cut a toxic person out of your